Good morning. Everyone doing well? Wonderful. I'm Teresita Hurtado Ramos. I'm the Assistant Director of Diversity and Inclusion and also the co-chair of the Equity and Diversity Conference. Welcome to this wonderful opportunity we have to spend with Howard J. Ross as part of our 2019 Equity and Diversity Conference. Among these invited guests are UNT and external community partners who share an interest in equity, diversity, and social justice. We asked invitees to submit topics or questions they would like to pose to Howard J. Ross, and among the questions emerged 4 salient themes: interpersonal efforts to address bias, bias awareness efforts, and what has come to be known as tribalism among students, identity-based groups, and institutional efforts to address bias and inclusion. We will model this conversation by our Director of Diversity and Inclusion, Shani Barrax Moore, posing one selected question from each of these categories to Howard J. Ross, on which we will spend about 5 minutes each. As we are on a tight schedule, since Howard J. Ross will be delivering our Equity and Diversity Conference keynote immediately after this discussion, I will function also as our timekeeper so that we have some limited time at the end for questions. We hope you enjoy this event, and we thank you for supporting the Equity and Diversity Conference. Now I will turn it over to Shani Barrax Moore and Howard J. Ross for our conversation.
Thank you, Teresita.
Hi, everybody.
All right, so we are going to jump right in to this discussion, and you all came up with some really great questions, and I think Howard's responses are going to be really insightful to us. So the
One
first,
would hope so. Anyway,
yes, you're always insightful,
Okay.
Howard, so I'm not worried about that. So the first question theme is about interpersonal efforts to address bias. And you talk in your most recent book, Our Search for Belonging, How the Need for Connection is Tearing Our Culture Apart, about how not talking about difference can deepen the divisions between us. And I think we hear that a lot, that you're creating problems by talking about it. Certainly we do as D&I practitioners. But though diversity has multiple benefits in areas such as problem solving and creativity, sudden increases in diversity can present challenges to social cohesion. Share with us what you mean by that and your recommendations for encouraging others to opt in to these conversations about difference and bias for broader impact beyond mandatory training.
Sure. Thanks, Shani, and hi, everybody. Good to be with you. I think that one of the things we've learned about the human mind, and we've had these amazing breakthroughs in the last couple of generations, understanding the brain and the mind and how we think, is that we're incredibly dominated by normalcy. Human beings like to do things that we're comfortable with doing, and we've seen how normalcy has shown up in the course of history, and how we look back at some of the things that were normal. It was normal not that long ago in human history for people to enslave other people, for a preacher to preach to his congregation on Sunday morning about loving thy neighbor as thyself, and then go home and beat his slaves before lunch, and for that to be normal. It was normal in Nazi Germany for people to turn in their neighbors, their Jewish neighbors, and then move into their homes, or normal in Rwanda for people to hack apart people who had been the people they grew up with. I mean, I could go on and on. In medicine, it was normal to do lobotomies. I mean, there are things that we look back at in human history that were just incredibly absurd and horrible that at the time we considered normal behavior. And so I think one of the things we have to realize is that we all have a susceptibility to going into the same pattern that we've been exposed to. And one of the reasons it's showing up so dangerously right now in our culture is because we're exposed to completely different sets of information. It used to be, and I'll talk about this a little bit more at length later on, but it used to be we all got the same basic information. We had different interpretations. Now we get pre-interpreted information. We don't even watch the news anymore. If you notice, we watch people watching the news. You turn on the news and there's this panel of people who are already interpreting it before you've actually heard the actual news story. And so as a result of that, what's begun to happen is we're more than ever before, we're collapsing our belief systems with their sense of humanity. In other words, there's no longer, I disagree with you about gun rights, as an example. It's now you're one of those kind of people. And once that happens, the objectification and the stereotyping of those people becomes more accentuated, because there's actually this psychological phenomenon called the out-group homogeneity effect. We tend to assume people outside of us are all the same. And so if you voted for President Trump, for example, and I voted for Secretary Clinton, then you must be one of those kind of people who believes this, this, and this, and this. And my own exploration, I interviewed over 100 people who voted for President Trump for the book, was shocked by how diverse they were in terms of their points of view, ranging from the sort of hardcore to people who said they held their nose and voted for him because they just couldn't vote for her. So from an interpersonal standpoint, I think one of the things that we need to try to do is to reach the humanity of the other person. You know, not just deal with a person based on their ideas, but actually reach them based on their humanity. You know, I was trained by Saul Alinsky, the great organizer, and he used to teach us two things. He used to say, first of all, always remember pragmatic idealism. You know, however enraged and righteous you are, your job is to move the needle. It's not just to be right. And the second thing he said was, in order to do that, you have to understand the other person's point of view as well or better than they do. Because if you're going to reach somebody, you have to speak to their listening. You have to speak to the way they're viewing the issue. And I think it's very hard for us, particularly at a time of outrage, like now when we're so, many of us, I certainly am so outraged by some of the things our government is doing and our president is doing. It's very hard to kind of cool ourselves down and not come from that pain and that wound and just react so that we meet righteousness with more righteousness, and then it kind of goes like this. It's reaching across the aisle to figure out how can we touch that person's humanity. You know, just one last example. I know we've got to move on, but one last example. I was I served on the External Diversity Advisory Board for the Human Rights Campaign for about 10 years, which was kind of interesting being a straight man on that group. I was the only straight man on the group. And this was during the time, of course, that the marriage equality campaign was being mounted, you know, the last push for the marriage equality. And one of the things that we realized was we had to give up on reaching the Westboro Baptist Church, for example, or people who are on the extreme. We were never going to meet those people on the extreme, and the more we tried, the more extreme that our message got. The people who won the day ultimately and who ended up, you know, bringing marriage equality to fruition in our country were the people in the middle. The 58-year-old woman who's gone to church all of her life and who's learned in church that this is a sin, but also has empathy for, you know, people who've been in a relationship for 30 years and can't be at each other's bedside when they're dying, or people who couldn't be with their children who they'd raised because they weren't legally adopted, or things like this. And it was speaking to that empathy in people that had them say, well, yeah, I guess I have to give up my personal beliefs for the greater good. So I think when we get off our own high horse and our own self-righteousness, we have a much greater chance of reaching people.
Great, thanks for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next question is about bias awareness efforts in tribalism among students. Mm-hmm. And as we in education strive to prepare students for their lives beyond our walls for employment or other endeavors, while this notion of tribalism may exist in the classroom, what are some practical ways educators can encourage and empower our students to be aware of their own biases and embrace others' perspectives? And it may be helpful here to provide some context with your definition of tribalism.
Yeah, because you and I were talking about this, Shani. I know that some people, you know, associate tribalism in this country just with Native Americans, and therefore it can show up as cultural appropriation. But the reality is we know that the whole notion of tribes has been in anthropology almost since the beginning. We had Nordic tribes, we had Celtic tribes, African tribes, you know. So we're using tribalism from the standpoint of a self-identified group that is mostly inwardly focused to protect themselves. Now, we know human beings have this tendency. One of the big breakthroughs we had in the work on bias was understanding that bias was as natural to human beings as breathing, and we can't make it go away. You know, for years and years and years, we did anti-bias trainings, and I go back 35 years to doing the old kind of diversity training where we literally used a 2x4 and beat on people who looked like this until somebody saw the error of their ways and cried, and it was cathartic for everybody. But you'd see those people a month later, and more times than not, they'd say, okay, that was okay, but don't ever make me do it again. You know, it was a good recipe for getting people not to say and do really stupid and offensive things, but it didn't encourage inclusion. It didn't encourage people to get more into the subject. If anything, they got more defensive about the subject and more protective about the subject. And so, again, from the standpoint, it's not from the standpoint of what feels good to us as practitioners, it's from the standpoint of what makes a difference, you know, what actually changes things. And so from the standpoint of when we look at what's happening now, we know similarly that human beings have a natural tendency to divide people between us and them. It probably goes back to years and years, you know, thousands of years ago when we were living in caves and jungles, and we saw a group of people around the water hole, and we had to determine instantly whether it was us or them, and if we made the wrong choice, we died. So we have a very sharp sorting mechanism. Now, sometimes, if that could be on a positive basis, which is, wow, you're different from me, I want to learn from you, and that's, of course, what we're trying to encourage with the diversity and equity and inclusion conversation. But more often, it's, you're different from me, therefore I have to be careful around you, or you're different from me, therefore I'm not going to like you, or I'm not going to engage with you. Students are exposed to this all the time, and of course we know that students divide themselves in lots of different ways, not just around diversity issues, but they're the jocks and the geeks and these various different distinctions, because as human beings we do this. I mean, I think the younger we are, the more exposed it is, the more we see it, the older we get, the more we sort of mask these things with civil behavior, that we're supposed to not say it quite so bluntly. But I think that what we've learned from studies, there's a tremendous amount of research on what kind of training, for example, works, what kind of education works. And I know you've seen this stuff, Shani, that says that diversity training doesn't work and unconscious bias training doesn't work. And sometimes people in our field tend to be really defensive about those studies, but there's some real valid stuff in the studies. And one of the most important is the recognition that the old kind of trainings we did, where we said, you'll never understand this because you're not a black woman. Actually, we can watch the brain and see that when that happens, the empathy center of the brain reduces. We get less empathetic to people who are telling us that. We get more defensive and more blocking a point of view. What does make a difference, and the kind of training that has been found to lead to more egalitarian and more equitable behavior, is training and education that teaches us to understand the way we think. So if we put that back in your context, if we help students understand why they are forming these groups, why they're so intensely in this in-group versus this out-group, and how it affects them, and how automatic it is, and how little of it is actually conscious choice, how much of it is automatic, then what will happen is people's natural tendency to want to see themselves as fair. I've worked now with literally hundreds of thousands of people, and not only is there research that shows this, but I've really come to believe it's true that very few people wake up in the morning and say, how can I suppress women and people of color today? That's not the way most of this bias shows up. A person wakes up and goes to school or goes to work or goes wherever, and they have these blind spots that have them inclined towards one person and towards another. So if you come to somebody like that who doesn't even know that they're doing it, and you come trying to attack them, it actually triggers activity in the dorsal posterior insular region of the brain, which is the part of the brain we associate with physical pain. And so what happens? They get defensive. You don't know me. You're accusing me of something that's not true in my own experience of myself. Even if we know it may be unconsciously true, I don't see it. And so rather than being able to listen, I'm going to have to defend myself. So I want to be really clear. I'm not in any way discouraging people from having very strong points of view, to be strong advocates. But there are two roles that we play in this work. One is advocacy, and the other is change management. Or change leadership. And there are different skills involved. When I'm marching in a Black Lives Matter march, or when I'm marching with the March for Lives, the young people who did the March for Lives march, or things like that, I'm being an advocate. My role is to speak for that group. When I'm trying to change behavior, my job is to be a change agent, and that requires a different way of thinking. It requires a way that allows everybody to be in the conversation so that we can move them. Because if we turn them off right from the start, they're not going to change. They're just going to get more deeply calcified in their point of view.
That's comforting, because I think a lot of the work that we do with our diversity and inclusion trainings, it's more about self-reflection and cultural humility, and not thou shalt not or else.
Yeah, I also want to be really clear, just really quickly, that there's limits to this. I mean, Jillian, I hope you don't mind my quoting you, but you just said something really profound. You said, there is no both sidism, if I get it right, there is no both sides when one side is genocide. So I'm not saying this is unlimited. I'm not saying anybody can be reached. I'm just saying that there are a lot of people who can be reached, and when we get those folks who can be reached to move over, the balance starts to shift, and all of a sudden we've got more power to promote change. Yeah.
Which is why ally development is
absolutely,
so important, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we at UNT, this is about identity-based groups. We at UNT, much like our external partners with us today, have identity-based groups. You kind of mentioned that a while ago, such as employee resource groups, faculty mentoring groups, student clubs, and other groups to develop bonding capital and a sense of belonging for our employees and students. However, there's some that may see those groups as exclusive. So how do you answer the question, why don't we have a heterosexual white male group? And similarly, how might you address the negative perceptions of these groups?
Well, first of all, I would say that it would be really great if we had white consciousness groups, if we had, and I don't mean white supremacy groups, I don't mean white nationalist groups, I mean people who were getting together to understand what it is to be a white person and to be more conscious of it. Because one of the things about being a dominant group is that we know that people in dominant groups have less attention on their group identity than people in non-dominant groups. And that shows up in lots and lots of different ways, both externally and internally. I mean, one great example of that is after 9/11, the term Muslim terrorist became so much a part of our culture, most people think it's one word, you know. And yet when Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols blew up Oklahoma City, you didn't hear people talking about Christian terrorists, even though they were not only both Christian, but they used Christianity to justify what they were doing. So we know that that's true. And so if we begin to, work on our own consciousness as white people, as men, whatever dominant group we're in, whether if we're wealthy, if we're, heterosexual versus LGBTQ or whatever, we have to work on our own consciousness and realize how much of that primacy that we've been given in our culture by those identities, and it's only when we do that we can begin to see it. But getting back to the essential of the question, I think a lot of it depends what you want the groups to do. In the early days of building affinity groups, and I'm talking 25, 30 years ago, affinity groups were a safe haven for people. You had very few people of color, you had very few women, or whichever group. I mean, in those days, of course, very few LGBTQ people were out in corporations and the like. And so, this was a place where you could go to feel, I'm finally with people like me, I can relax, I can be myself, we can support each other, we can strengthen each other. What's happened over time is there's been an evolution of that into seeing these groups as really an asset to the organization, whether it's a college, university, or business. And that is that, gosh, we can go to folks in this group and say, are you seeing things in our recruiting process that may be turning off people of color that we're not noticing? Can you look at our education pattern and see if there are any things we're missing that we should be talking about? You can get that other perspective, and we know that other perspective can be really helpful. And at the same time, in certain circumstances, it can reinforce difference as opposed to sameness. So one of the things I'm finding that some of our more progressive organizations are doing is they're creating some of these groups around issues rather than identity. So for example, rather than having a women's ERG, you have a gender equity ERG in which men and women who are committed to gender equity could be together. But in the meetings, for example, one client that I've been doing this work with, in their meetings, they get together once a month for 3 hours, and the first hour to hour and a half of the meeting is separate. The men are in one room, the women are in the other room, and they get a chance to process and talk about what the issues are. Then they come together and share what they've come up with and compare and contrast, and then together they work on how can we together move together to forward the issues or concerns that we're doing. So I think
bonding and bridging.
Exactly right. Exactly right. The bonding and bridging happens, and I think that's I think that those are really powerful because they're future oriented. They're oriented towards building a culture of equity, towards building a culture of inclusion, a culture of belonging. I would say they're not just oriented towards fixing the past. Now we have things in the past we have to be fixed. So it's not an all or nothing thing. But if we're moving towards building something, human beings are more inspired by building something than they are by fixing things, by our nature. We can get really turned on about building something new. At some point, when all we're doing is fixing things, we start to get tired of it and burn out because it's like Sisyphus. It feels like if all you're focused on is fixing things, it's like driving a car looking at the rear view mirror.
Racial battle fatigue.
Exactly. Yeah, racial battle fatigue. That's well put. And if all we're focused on is fixing things, we will always find things to fix. There are unlimited numbers of things to fix. And so we can get stuck sort of in a doom loop of that if we're not careful.
Okay, thanks. So this next question is about institutional efforts to address bias and inclusion. So many of us are here because we're involved with efforts within our organizations to address bias, diversity, and inclusion. Through your firm, Cook Ross, you have worked with many companies, as you mentioned, such as Starbucks, for example, to institutionalize diversity, equity, and inclusion. What advice can you give us as best practices for moving towards institutionalization of these concepts through what we like to call here 4 Ps, policies, practices, programs, and people?
Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, just to be clear, I mean, the work I did with Starbucks was mostly giving them advice on their training and develop, just want to be clear. But I think that, diversity and inclusion, whatever we want, equity, they're interesting subjects in terms of the way you see how major organizations deal with them. Because, most organizations I've encountered, the majority of them, the way they deal with it is, you do a diversity training, you have Black History Month celebration, International Food Day in a cafeteria, and you check off that's diversity. It's a series of events. And I don't know any serious initiative that I've ever seen in institutional life that's handled in that way. And yet for some reason we accept it is. It's laughable. And some of these events are great and they're exciting and we have great conferences. By the way, I know what you're doing here is well beyond that. But a lot of organizations will have conferences like this and that will be their diversity effort for the year. And the conference is great, But if you then go right back to the same thing, it not only doesn't fundamentally change the system, it actually can breed cynicism, because we're not living the things that we're promoting. So it's, you talk a great game, but you're not walking your talk. So I do think that we need to look systemically. And, from my standpoint, I was trained actually as an organizational development practitioner. That was where my training come from, my diversity training. Because, of course, when I was trained, I'm 68 years old, so when I was trained to do diversity work, there was no diversity work you could get trained in. We were basically making it up as we were going along, coming from the best of intentions. Now we know otherwise, and what we've learned is that you can look at an organizational system using change management theory and use that to change some of the dynamics we're talking about. So, for example, where bias is concerned, education is a great start. If you do the right kind of education, you can absolutely trigger people, and you can get them to look at things differently, and sometimes really, want to take on new ways of being. But if you do an unconscious bias training, and then you don't have to do, let's say, a performance review if one of your jobs is to give performance or grading students or something like that. You don't do that for 3 or 4 months. What are the odds that what you learned in that training are going to affect you 3 or 4 months ago? Far more likely you'll slip back into your normalized patterns of behavior and the normalized patterns of behavior of the culture. So the second piece then is that we have to put in priming devices, ways that when you're about to do that performance review, something reminds you. So, for example, one of the things that we did is we created these 2-minute little videos that live on an app that somebody can have on their cell phone. And let's say I've got to grade a student, or I've got to do a performance review on a faculty member. On my way to that meeting, I pop up this little 2-minute video. This is for after training, assuming you've already had the education. And it says, you're going into a performance review, remember these 5 things that can help you mitigate bias in a performance review. And so the chances then of it being present for me at that moment are dramatically higher. Then the third part is to look at our and by the way, these aren't necessarily linear,
right.
But the third part is to look at our structures and systems and say, are there ways that we could do a better job of interviewing? And so, for example, one of the things that we learned is that race, culture, introversion, extroversion, all of these different things play a huge role in how somebody could be in a job interview. For example, if I'm conducting an interview and I'm interviewing a young white man, he's much more likely to very quickly get into a rhythm with me because he understands culturally where I'm coming from. And so if we can begin to look at, something where interviewing is concerned, we found is something as simple as when somebody's coming in for an interview, you send them an email and say, here are the 3 major points we're going to be discussing in the interview, or here are the 3 questions I'm going to be asking you. Then that balances that out because it allows people to get more comfortable with the material. People who tend to be more introverted, either because of personality or cultural style, will be more prepared to answer. And in American culture, the generalized American culture I'm talking now, we put such a high premium on fast and quick answers rather than good and solid answers. So this is a whole issue that we could get into about introversion and how it's viewed. And so something as simple as that can make a big difference in some cases. And so, for example, in my book, Everyday Bias, there's 16 pages in the back of ideas like that people could do. And then the last is we have to establish measures of accountability that actually help us understand where the breakdowns are happening. So, for example, let's say we have a goal to hire, a company I know is doing this. Their goal is to hire 40% women in an industry where the average company has about 25% women. So big goal, right? So they create a batch of metrics. They, just measuring how many there are doesn't provide the answer. So they've had 4 metrics. One is how many people apply for jobs, how many people are offered jobs, how many people accept those jobs, and how many people are successful after 6 months. I don't care who you hire. If they're not successful after 6 months, it's a waste of time for you and for them, right? So let's say only 20% apply for jobs. Now we know we need to spread the net wider. We've got to go out and find that talent. Let's say 40% apply, but only 20% are offered jobs. Then either you're getting the wrong people to apply, or there's something differential happening in your hiring structure.
Or
let's
fit,
say, exactly. Yeah, the whole thing of fit. We could do a whole trip on that, right? Let's say 40% are offered, but only 20% accept. Then we know that at the very least, people are not being turned on to work at your place in the interviewing process, and they may in fact be being turned off in subtle ways, messaging that we don't even see. And then finally, let's say 40% accept the job, but only 20% are successful after 6 months. Then we need to look at what's happening in the organization. How are people not being brought up to speed in the organization? And that's just one example, but you can see what this allows us to do is to be much more granular about where the breakdown is. The difference is like a lot of people do diversity. Like, well, I heard that Shani over at UNT is doing this. I'm going to try it. It's a little bit like my car dies on the side of the road and I say, well, she changed her tire, so I'll try to change my tire and see if it works. What this allows us to do is say, it looks like the problem is in the catalytic converter. Let's look there and see what we can fix. So.
That's great. And it's interesting because, people think that anybody can be a diversity and inclusion practitioner, but there's so much more backstory to that you kind of mentioned about getting folks to really look at their own personal perspectives.
Well, that's really important. If I could just take a moment to that, because that's really critical. My experience has been that a lot of us in the diversity space are healing our own wounds. I mean, that's a lot of what we're doing, is we're coming from our own core wounding. And, for me, it's because, my family comes from Eastern Europe. We're Jewish, and we had enormous family loss in the Holocaust. We know 43 members of our family were killed on August 2nd and 3rd, 1942, when the Nazis killed all but 100 of the 5,000 Jews who lived in the community that my grandfather grew up in the western Ukraine. And so, for me, there's no question that's why I do this work. I didn't even realize that for a long time because it was so deeply embedded. But that's what has me here. For a lot of folks I know, it's race, it's gender, it's whatever that has had us feel excluded and has us feel that pain that fuels our work. And that's good. I mean, it's good that we can take pain and turn it into positive action. But it also means a lot of times that we're trying to use that person to heal our wound. And that doesn't allow for us to have a good sense of balance when we're doing the work. It allows us to be very easily reactive, and therefore sometimes we lose our ability to do the work as effectively as we might. And so I think it's important for us to explore that in ourselves and to develop tools to really heal ourselves, with other people from the inside, so that when we're doing work with people, we can't be so easily triggered and be knocked off our game.
Yeah, we talk about that too. Yeah, we're just dropping the mic here.
That's it.
Okay. Love it. So we always ask all of our experts what suggestions you have, other than your own books, but your own books too, for recommended reading, listening, articles, theater, dance, or music that informs bias awareness and inclusion work. And after this, we're going to open the floor for questions. So those of you that are thinking of questions for Howard, as he's answering this, you can raise your hand.
I think one thing just generally is to expose ourselves to other ways of thinking without feeling like we have to agree or disagree, but just to understand where other people are coming from. I mean, there's some great books out there right now. I mean, Robin DiAngelo, your book on white fragility, I think is an important book for any white person to read. I mean, not just white people, but especially for white people to read. There's so many great thinkers out there who are doing it, and I think we can look from various different perspectives and see that. I think another thing that we can do is just constantly give ourselves exposure to other cultures. One of the things I used to do before I had my iPad and my reading was on my iPad years ago when I used to travel, every time I went to the airport, I developed this habit. I would go into the magazine shop at the airport, and I would go to the upper right-hand corner of the magazine shop, and I would grab whatever magazine it was, and that's what I would read on the airplane. And so sometimes they were language, like I don't speak Spanish, so it's a Spanish language magazine. I couldn't even read it, but I could still learn a lot about culture by looking at it. Watching different things on TV, exposing yourself to different thinkers, even thinkers who we abhor sometimes. It's important gets back to what Alinsky was saying, for us to understand other people's thinking. It's really important. Yesterday, I was in Plano with my old business partner. I was staying with her, and so in the morning I'm recovering from knee surgery, so I was doing physical therapy, and I was watching CNN's coverage of the hearing. And of course, they had their panel of 8 people out ready to analyze it for 3 hours before the hearing ever started. Then they got in my car, so I decided, well, let me see if I can find a conservative talk show radio. And sure enough, I was able to find one. Happened to turn it on right when he was beginning his show at 9 o'clock. And he said, well, we got this liar Cohen out there who's doing blah, 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 blah. And he went on and on for about 2 minutes. And he said, so we're not going to waste any time with that today. And that was the end of the conversation. So over here, you have constant 100% coverage. Over here, 2 minutes, and that was it. So we have to, the more we can dig into this other point of view, and from a political standpoint, the one book that I would really strongly recommend is a book called The Righteous Mind by a guy named Jonathan Haidt, who's a professor at NYU who studies moral psychology. And he does a really remarkable job of helping understand how conservatives and liberals see the world differently and why we see the world that we do. And then, of course, can help us understand the difference between the various, extensions. There are people who are conservative who are anti-Trump. There are people who are conservative who are kind of in the middle. There are people who are conservative or for Trump, and everything, same true on the left. And so to get the nuance rather than to think everybody's the same on each side.
kind of goes back to that whole notion of tribalism. And
Exactly
and
right.
yeah,
Exactly
okay.
right.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Teresita is going to now take some questions. I see, Tracy, you've got your hand up over there.
Testing. We're recording.
Yeah.
Hi, how are you?
Hello, thank you. Hi,
Hi, Tracy.
my name's Tracy Everbach. I'm the head of the Women's Faculty Network here on campus. My question is about empathy. So one of the things that I find when I have discussions with people is that it's very difficult to get through to them that they need to have empathy for other people.
Right.
So is empathy something that can be taught? Is it something that's innate in people as they're growing up? You know, how does one develop empathy?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, Tracy. And you know, empathy is a field that's really actually, there's some very interesting research being done right now. It's a good friend of mine. His name's Sukhvinder Singh Obi, who's head of the Brain, Body, and Action Lab at McMaster University in Toronto, who actually studies empathy and power in the brain. And what we've discovered is, first of all, the empathy is measurable, that it's produced by the premotor cortex of the brain in the form of these mirror neurons that, as social creatures, we develop because it gives us a sense of sensing what other people are feeling. So everybody here has had an experience of a mirror neuron reaction. You're watching something on TV, let's say somebody gets punched in the stomach and you feel yourself go, ooh. That's a mirror neuron reaction, and it's part of who we are as social animals. It gives us a sense of being able to figure out what's out there. In the prefrontal cortex, it's referred to sometimes as theory of mind, you know, the sense that we can try to figure out what people are thinking before they're thinking. So we can measure empathy, and we know a certain number of things about empathy. We know that power diminishes empathy, that the more power somebody has, the less they produce empathy. And it's not that people who are power become nasty people or mean people. It's just that when we're in a power position, we need to understand what's going around us less because we can go ahead and do what we're doing without thinking about it. If you think about any time you've been in a low power position, let's say you were a new hire in a job or something like that, what's the natural tendency? You're watching everything around you so that you could figure out where the landmines are, right? That breeds empathy because you're putting yourself into people's worlds. Of course, this shows up in terms of identity. So, you know, so when they do testing in various different ways, for example, we find that women have a tendency to have more empathy than men because the low power position in our societal structure puts women in a situation where you have to be watching out for what's around you and learn ways to deal with that power in order to survive. And so as a result of the fact, women have less empathy towards men. Now, some people think that that's inherently biological, but it's probably not. We know now that it's probably not because when they do certain studies where they, in certain situations, they give people relatively equal power, we find that male and female behavior tends to replicate each other, you know, in those circumstances. And so how do we teach empathy? Well, one of the things that we do to teach empathy is that we get people to slow down a little bit and to observe themselves in a group. How are they acting in a group versus how other people are acting, and focus on understanding the other person in a way that I can understand it. And this is one of the things that we find in the old diversity trainings when we say, you'll never get this because you are this. What you're saying to the person is, you know, well, you're saying I'll never get it, so I guess I'll never get it. You know, what's the point? When we say to people, have you had an example of being subject to bias yourself? And somebody might say, well, yeah, sometimes I feel as a white guy that people assume that I'm conservative or assume that I'm racist. How did that feel? You know, felt pretty crummy. I feel like I'm not known, I'm not seen. Now, can you see how a woman might feel that in such and such a circumstance? Oh, yeah, I guess I could. So what we're speaking is to the common human experience. And when we speak to the common human experience, by definition, we encourage empathy. Now, obviously, that requires a lot of patience. And I'm not saying it's true, as I said earlier, I'm not saying it applies in all circumstances. When you have somebody like a Richard Spencer or a David Duke, for example, who have bound their identity to hate, you know, this is how they identify themselves, this is their job, in essence, you're not going to reach them. And so in that circumstance, you need to contain those folks. But we can build empathy in those people, as I was describing in the case of the marriage equality campaign, we can build empathy in other people by saying, what do you think it would feel like for you if you spent 30 years with somebody and couldn't be at their bedside when they were dying? Well, that was a very common experience that people could have, and they could feel the pain of it, even in the circumstance. So the more we can put people into other people's worlds, the more empathy there is. Now, I will say one other thing, which is that we do know that some human beings have less capacity for empathy than others. You know, for example, people on the spectrum You know, people on the autism spectrum tend to have their brains produce less mirror neurons, and it's nothing to do with them being bad people. This is why anybody who's been around an Aspie kid, if you've ever been around an Aspie child at a birthday party, they're often huddling in the corner like this because they don't have the capacity that kids who have, you know, this production of mirror neurons do to sense what other people are doing, what they're like, what they're feeling and thinking. So you can imagine how terrifying it must be to be in a circumstance where all these people are there, you have no idea what their agenda is, you know? And so we see this sometimes as antisocial behavior. It's not antisocial behavior, it's actually an inability to sense what's going on and therefore to know how safe you are. So but as a rule, most people have this capacity and we can speak to it in that way. So I hope that's helpful.
We've got time for one more question.
Yeah.
Testing.
Sorry, I guess I went on too long, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah,
So,
okay, sorry.
Probably not a quick question, just to be fair, but if you could provide some help, that'd be great. So historically, I've always really loved talking to people who are ideologically very different than me. In the Trump era, for lack of better terminology, that seems almost impossible. Like, it feels like everyone's kind of been pushed to the edges. And so having that conversation that normally brings you to the middle seems exponentially more difficult. Do you have any suggestions for how to do that more effectively?
Yeah, well, in my lunchtime talk, I'm going to actually give you a very specific tool to use for that, so I'm not going to get into that now. But what I will say is this, you know, I consciously on social media go out and try to find people like that to have conversations with. And I start the conversation. If it goes south, if people start calling names or things like that, then I'll say, look, you know, there's no point in this and not continue. But I've found there are an awful lot of people on the other side of the political spectrum from me who really want that to happen, but they're also feeling the pain of separation. Now, they're righteous about their point of view, just like we're righteous about our point of view, but they do want to make these connections. So just one example, there's a guy named Paul who lives in Jacksonville, Florida, who 2.5 years ago trolled me on a tweet. He said, "You liberals, da-da-da-da-da." And I responded, as I often do, which say, "I'll be glad to have a civil conversation with you about this if you'd like." And we've now been in a 2.5-year dialogue. We've talked on the phone numerous times. We disagree about almost everything. Now, to be fair, he's not an extreme racist or anything like that. You know, he's more of a not mainstream, but traditional conservative, military guy. But we've been engaged in this conversation and developed mutual respect for each other. He's a good and decent person. He sees the world differently than me, but he's a good and decent person. And one time he said to me, he said, "Look, I know I must frustrate you because you haven't changed my mind about much." He says, "But I want you to know you've changed my mind about something very important." And I said, "What's that, Paul?" He said, "You've changed my mind about liberals." And I kind of laughed when he said it. He said, "No, really." He said, "I used to think that liberals were these people who all felt the same and it was all a bunch of crap and da-da-da-da-da." He said, "Now I realize that they're good and decent people over there who just disagree with me about some of these things." And he and I have talked about some issues like gun rights and things like this, where I think if we were in a position, we could probably find some compromise that could at least move us in a positive direction because we've maintained a sense of respecting each other's humanity even as we disagree with issues. So I would just encourage you to try to find people. And you don't have to start with a 50-pounder, start with a 5-pounder. You know, find a person who it's not that big of an issue. And, you know, I'll share this tool, I call it taking the other to lunch. But you share this tool, which is a structured conversation. And this is another thing that's really valuable. Yeah, I got it. She's telling me I have to stop. But that if we create a structure for the conversation that's not just free-flowing, it also allows people to relax and feel more safe.
Well, thank you, Howard. I think that's a great place to end, and thanks for spending this time with us.